Our panelists this morning include Dr. Orrin Murray, who again is Director of Technology and R&D at UChicago Impact. We have Mr. James Kutnow, who is Dean and Director of Graham Elementary and Middle School in Columbus, Ohio, and his colleague, Ms. Cassie Muller, who is a math teacher, instructional coach, and resident educator coordinator at Graham Elementary and Middle School. Both Mr. Kutnow and Mrs. Muller have played an instrumental role in the development of the Cultivate survey and reporting site. They worked with Dr. Murray and team at UChicago Impact in the development and refinement of the reporting site, and with Dr. Farrington and team at the UChicago Consortium as they developed the survey. And finally, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator, award-winning journalist Cassie Walker Burke. As many of you know, Cassie is the founding Chicago bureau chief of Chalkbeat, a nonprofit news site dedicated to covering public education in America. Before joining Chalkbeat, Cassie was assistant managing editor at Crain's Chicago Business and also was part of Crain's editorial board. She was also executive editor of Chicago Magazine, and her work has appeared in local and national outlets ranging from the Chicago Tribune to Politico to O, the Oprah magazine. So thank you all again for being here this morning, and Cassie, I will let you take things from here.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me today. And what a great panel. I'm super excited to have this conversation. So, Orrin, why don't we start with you? Can you walk us through the conversation that you had when you called James, or when you reached out to James? What is the pitch? What is the pitch here to school leaders, and what kinds of questions were you getting? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Well, I think the pitch is pretty simple, which is to say, how can we help you improve what's going on in your school? And so, a lot of this was done by Camille and her team on the front end, and we came in and said, we have these tools where we can provide you with all of this data, but let's try and figure out a way to make this data more actionable, and you have to spend less time sort of digging in and trying to make sense of it. So that's essentially the pitch.
And James, for you, a school administrator has a bajillion things on the list. Kind of where did this land, and what was your thinking? What did you have hesitations? What problems were you trying to solve?
I guess I'll start by saying we are a partner with EL Education, which Camille referred to, and part of that partnership is their intentionality around what they have three focuses for schools. They have the traditional academic, achievement, mastery of knowledge and skills is what they call it. We have culture and character is another one, and the third part is high quality student work. And so as part of our work with EL, we actually were introduced to Camille's original research. And so when I got a call and an invitation to be a part of the study, we started to put those dots together and said, we're all in. This is work that aligns with some of the focuses that we have. We're excited about what we can learn based on some of the goals we had already started to think through setting on these non-cognitive factors of achievement.
Can you talk a little bit about what did you see at the time were the strengths of your school, and what did you see the places that you felt like you needed to work on that this kind of resonated for you?
Yeah, Camille's first visit to us, she had us look at that flow chart and try to think through what does that look like at GEM. So academic behaviors, academic mindsets, strategies in the classroom. And so we took a look as a leadership team and used little post-it notes and wrote every little detail and ritual and tradition and effort we do in the school. So after school programs, student-led conferences, how we use learning targets, habit targets, the discipline processes. And so we would chart each of those on that flow chart. And in the end, she said, well, how do you know that you've been successful with your students? And for us, it was not that everybody's getting A's. That's great. We want to see academic achievement, but we want to see our 8th graders, when they do what we call our passage presentations, kind of like a master's defense of I'm ready for high school, that they're able to get up front in front of a panel, take this seriously, and show that they actually have done X, Y, and Z. They have grown, they've shown academic successes, that they have learned from the behavior processes that maybe they've been a part of. So all those things together, when we can see every 8th grader get up and do that successfully, and bring pride to themselves and their families, then yeah, we know that this is successful. So then in thinking that through with Camille, it's like, okay, now we can actually put this tool out there and get student perceptions of what are we actually trying to do? Is it making a difference? Or maybe it's not, and we need to tweak that a little bit. So being able to dig deeper was huge.
And for you, how did you present this to your staff? Because I imagine that's something you have to really think carefully about to get buy-in.
To some degree, it's kind of like, this is what we're doing, right? It was non-invasive in terms of getting students to get on the computer and do the survey. That's not a hard component, 15 minutes or whatever. So that was fine. And then when the data came back, at first it was more just leadership teams looking at this, but then we're kind of introducing more data to the staff. And I'll have to say that we have a great school staff that we constantly talk about growth mindset. And we're a small school, so when 8th grade science results aren't looking too good, you kind of know who that is. And that was a reality. But just having an honest conversation, again, this is student perceptions, this is real data. How can we grow? How can we school-wide make changes? I mean, we teachers, educators, we do walkthroughs all the time, right? And walkthroughs there's a component of walkthroughs that this is school-wide data, right? So percentage of our classrooms are doing this and percentage are not. And we want to be doing those things. So let's think about how we can be doing those better. And some of the teachers are knocking it out of the park, and some of them need a little bit more support. So just having honest conversations about that for whole school improvement.
And what did the data tell you about your particular school? Like, where were you really strong? Where were you hitting it out of the park? And where did you feel like, ooh?
Yeah, not surprisingly, since day one, we've always talked about creating learning targets and using learning targets with our students in every class, in every grade. So that component of the feedback was strong. We're doing this and we're practicing it, and that's great. I think some of the first eye-opening components to us were student beliefs in their ability to succeed. So the idea that I'm not good at math, I'll never be good at math. That was oh wow, okay. We need to think about how we're communicating the ability and achievement possibilities for all students. And it's not just that you're not good at math. No, we can grow on this, we can learn on this, we can work with you. So those were the first two things that stuck out to us.
Yeah. Cassie, can you talk a little bit about teacher buy-in?
Yeah, as James mentioned, we have an amazing staff at our school, and so I remember I was a second-year teacher, I think, when we started working with you, so I was not quite at a leadership team level at that time, I guess, and I remember James coming back and saying that we were going to do some research work with Camille Farrington, and our staff was really excited about it. We had the opportunity to hear her speak in Detroit at the EL Education National Conference, and we were so excited that she was on stage sharing this work that she was doing with our school, and so teachers were believing in what she was sharing and really excited about the opportunity.
And so among teachers, what was the conversation like? So we have this survey and we're going to see these things that reveal our strengths, but also that could be critical of some of the work we're doing. Can you talk a little bit about those conversations? Give us a little insight into that, and then maybe how they shifted over time.
Yeah. I think it depends on which teacher you're talking to a lot of the times. For most of our staff, it was an exciting opportunity to see what our students thought. And at first, the data was a little bit shocking. And like Camille mentioned, the teacher alignment with the student information does not always match up. And what we think is happening in our classrooms is not what students perceive as happening in our classrooms. And so most teachers were excited to know where we could grow from there and move forward with that to make our school a better place. And as we started collecting more data, I feel like the buy-in just kept getting more and more because there's so much research out there just about, and especially with what Camille's doing about the classroom conditions and what impact that can have on our students.
A question for you, or James, either one. Can you give a specific example or two of a moment or a conversation or where a teacher changed his or her practice based on what they saw in the survey tool, or did something differently in the classroom based on what they had learned? Either one. Jump on.
Well, I am a math teacher, and so when I learned that our students had this perception of themselves that they were not good at math and they would never be good at math, I was like, oh no, I really need to do something about that. And so my shift as a teacher became more about the process of solving problems rather than getting to a final solution. And so oftentimes we just we go through the process of what we would do to solve a problem rather than celebrating that somebody got the question right. We celebrate the different strategies that people used. And that's become a really big part of my class. Like, we name strategies for solving after students that presented that strategy. And so students that may not typically feel successful in a math classroom because maybe they're not getting their answers correct, they have this strategy named after them that is like, yeah, I did that. And so everyone calls it that. We have the Dabberoni, which another student named. They just come up with these crazy names, but it's fun and the kids get that buy-in and really feel like they belong because of that. Yeah, like dabbing. They love that one.
Dabbing. James, I don't know if there's anything you would add, anything that you saw that changed in the building or a specific instructional approach that changed?
I mean, I think one of the data points from the last year or so was the sense of belonging and reinforcing with teachers, like, are we greeting students as they come in the classroom? Are we engaging them in a sense before the classroom work really begins? And how are we debriefing our learning targets and our habit targets? So being strategic as a staff with our goals for the year to really hone in on some of those specific practices so that when we do walkthroughs, that's a point that we're going to look for, that we can impact the environment from the very beginning of each class period, and what difference does that make in the student's sense of belonging in that classroom. Yeah.
So I have to ask this question, Dana, I'm going off script. But we're in day 7 of a teacher strike here in Chicago, and I think that a lot of the conversations I've heard on picket lines are really about how teachers feel about the value of their profession. And so how can a tool like this be something that uplifts teachers and also school cultures among not just the children and the adults in the building, and not something that becomes another feeling demoralizing them? I had to ask. So.
I would say, we're from Columbus, Ohio. We're not on strike right now. They're functioning without us, which is great. Camille, when she sat down with us, one of the first things she said after we went through that exercise was, I don't know what your data is going to say before we even took the survey, because it's proven to work. So in some regards, you can tell staff, like, this is just another piece of information that is important to reflect on. And so being able to use the tool that Orrin and the team have created is extremely helpful to kind of navigate different classrooms and grade levels. And yeah, I guess you could look at a negative side of, like, well, this will speak poorly of a specific person's practice, and that's not the conversation at all. It really is, if we can focus on the students and the ability for students to grow, how can we take this data and not target a specific person or a specific classroom, but turn this into a school-wide culture initiative in a sense? Is that it?
It does, but I'm going to push you a little bit because that's what I do. But if you're in a school where you only have one science teacher and you know pretty much what that data is saying and who that person is in the building, like, how do you navigate that? Oh, please.
Well, so as we have instructional coaches at our school, and so like James shared, we did not just share all of the information right away. And so as a leadership team, as instructional coaches, we were able to target specific teachers, specific classrooms, and what we could do to help them, to help their students feel supported and like the classroom conditions were being met. And so I can, as an instructional coach, use some of this data to go into a classroom and kind of in my mind have an idea of what we need to focus on, and then also work on getting that teacher buy-in, but it's not this glaring like, oh, you're really not doing a good job at this. It's building their buy-in to it and their belief that they can make a change.
I think looking at the tool is non-evaluative. I mean, this is student perceptions, which is real, right? When we have those conversations about discipline or whatever, like that reality to them is reality, whether it's real to me or not. But how do you help a student process what's going on in their head? And so as a teacher, how do I say this? As an administrator, you kind of know where your weaknesses are in the building, right? And how do you support that teacher? Well, you can say, hey, this is some data that we've collected. It looks like in your class students are feeling this way. What do you think? And having a conversation with individual staff members, if it gets to that point where it's individually recognizable, you know, what students are saying, let's reflect on this data and what can we do to improve our practices. It's not like, well, okay, now we have an evaluation of your annual, you know, whatever we call it, the Ohio State teacher. And that's not coming up on those conversations. You know? So separating that, I think, is an important part of this.
One last question before we go to audience questions. What's next for each of you? Orrin, I'll start with you with this project.
So, I mean, one of the things that is getting the word out, right? Helping people understand that there is an opportunity to take in student perceptions and voice about what's going on in their classrooms and shape it in ways that can have an impact on them doing well in those classrooms. So getting the word out is absolutely what's next. And Camille mentioned, you know, that so Cultivate is taken in the fall, right after things are settled for schools, and then in the spring to give a sense of how well you've managed over that particular time. And as an assessment, if you will, there's a lot of time in between, right? And so, you know, we're working with Camille and Perks to try and figure out how do we do more sort of micro dipsticks along the way. So those are some of the things that next.
Cool. James, what about you? Cassie?
I two answers. One is that we've been able to use this tool a number of times. And so looking at it from year to year, the more you use this tool, the more information over time we can see on what strategic shifts have we made with intentionality, and does that show up on the data? And so just being able to evaluate that and continuing that process year after year. But second of all, I love the last component of the interactive results that we were able to see, that there are practical suggestions to make a big difference. You know, and if we look at this data as a leadership team or as a staff even, we can't go crazy and implement 20 new things, you know? So what's gonna get the biggest bang for your buck, for your work that you're doing? And so really taking those suggestions and making them individualized to our school and to our student environment, and hopefully seeing the difference. Yeah.
You sort of mentioned this when you asked about the Chicago teacher strike, but as a teacher, and you guys probably know this, but the work is really challenging. There's a lot of time and intentionality that goes into planning every lesson, to getting the student work back. What feedback am I going to give them? And the Cultivate tool can help prioritize what is most important. And so that's something that I am continuing to pick apart. What is most important in the classroom culture that I'm setting up with my 7th grade math students, and how can I place value on the things that are going to get the biggest bang for their buck?
Audience questions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, beyond supporting individual teachers whose scores you can see, like, what is the teaming culture? Cassie, you spoke about what's the growth look like in your school for adults. Like, what are some examples of what you all are doing to build, like, a teacher culture of teams that can look at this and say, to the point of the presentation, it's not about the students, it's about the environment we're creating?
Well, I think one component from a leadership standpoint is how we set our goals and how we analyze those goals. And so we do this process at the beginning of the summer for the following year. And then we review it halfway through the year formally, and then again at the end of the year. And then there's in-between points in our leadership team where we're collecting the data points that we're going to be using for that mid-review and the end of the year review. And so how do we use this tool to look at those individual goals? We're talking like 1 or 2 school-wide goals. But using that data not as a honing down to classroom level, but as school-wide level, making tweaks in our plan or in our goals or in our professional development plans with our teachers to support them in this process. Because again, nobody wants one more thing to do or two more things to check off.
And we do something called inquiry cycles with our teachers that are focused in our school goals. And so as James mentioned, we set the work plan at the beginning of the summer, and then within, we have trimesters at our school. Each trimester focuses on a different goal. And teachers have the autonomy to choose what their interest is within that goal, and then they are doing research in their own classrooms and putting a new practice into place. And then coming back every Wednesday, and we report out what changes we're seeing in our classroom. Is our data shifting? Right now, I'm specifically focusing on how can I get students to start on the work? Like, how quickly can we get started on the work? How can I support them in just feeling confident to get started on the work? So I'm collecting data and just simply timing, and 3 minutes into class, I'm counting how many students have started work. And then I'm making changes to my practice and how I interact with students based on that. So that's all based in the work plan, which we pull from the Cultivate survey, from teacher surveys, and that kind of thing.
So it's kind of a combination question. So reference like on the 5 essentials, they actually have developed strategies that schools can implement. So you're talking about like how do we implement strategies over years? How are we documenting what's working, what's having that positive impact, that's increasing that growth mindset? Is that like a future portion of the tool, or and then at the school level, how are we documenting kind of creating this sharing process?
So, one of the things that I think I'll say is that it's important to remember that the results of this survey is based on student perceptions, right? So at the beginning of a school year, you have students. At the beginning of the next school year, you have different students. And so those perceptions for that particular classroom are going to change year over year. And theoretically, the teacher who is learning about the ways in which she or he is engaging with students in that classroom, they will see some growth as well, right? So one of the things that we've worked with our partners in building this site is to say that, we don't do trend analysis year over year because it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? The trend that should make sense is, are you seeing students in your school getting more A's and fewer F's, right? Because at the end of the day, that should be what we care about. That should be the measure of success. And along the way, there are these small things that we can do to sort of check in. Do kids feel like they belong? Or are they saying that, this new science curriculum is relevant to them in their future? Obviously, that's going to change based on who answers it, but you can begin to try and roll that up slightly.
I think that for my most recent reflections and experience, this information helps us dig deep, right? And so as a school leader, I need to be mindful that that's at one level, and then we have a bunch of teachers down here. So we can't overwhelm them with this level of depth. We just realized this last Wednesday, like we need to go back to learning targets and how to write good learning targets, because some of our new teachers didn't get the 3-day PD 3 years ago, and so we kind of took a step back for a second, just specifically talking about learning targets. So when we talk about, okay, so how does the student sense of belonging work in your classroom? Whoa, like first, let's back up a few steps of how are you organized to prepare for your students to enter into your classroom, maybe first and foremost. So being able to differentiate that information, I think, and then documenting over time, I think, I can't say I have a formal process of it, but I can look at the data from each survey and what makes sense. These are things we worked on and these are things that we need to improve on. And the next year, we can say that certain things were improved upon because of what we learned and started to implement. And so there's a little ebb and flow of where are we going with this, but it's a helpful tool to kind of help direct that so it's not too far off left and right.
Mostly for Cassie, as a teacher, and and having been a teacher, I know it's really easy to get sucked into considering my students' performance and not using blame, but using like the rain as reasons for my students' performance, right? And it wasn't until a mindset shift happened in me where it was like, well, actually, I'm in control of a lot of the environment that I'm setting up that can increase this performance. And especially for new teachers, can you talk about, has there been a shift in mindsets to flip that orientation from this is due to a child or a family relationship that I have, or a bad relationship with an administrator, or my colleague next door, or the snow outside, or like, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes. There has absolutely been a shift, and in myself, I see it too in my time at GEMS. But it's not perfect by any means. There are still those moments where it's like, oh, I can't teach today because there's this student that's causing chaos in class in this moment, and so I didn't get through my lesson or whatever is happening. And so it's constantly a work in progress. I think teaching is just always a growth progress and checking like, oh, I need to reframe how I'm thinking about that and how I can meet my students' needs. And within our staff culture, the people who have been there longer, I feel like really are probably better at keeping that mindset more often. And then as new staff spends more time in our school and with the data and just the culture that we've built at our school, I think we start seeing that shift in more and more people.
So a follow-up question. Do you see a shift in mindsets of students and helping engender the types of environment itself? I mean, this probably matters more for like, I feel like adolescent, like high school students. Like we see in the presentation that it's like, oh right, I remember this, like what do my friends think? That's what's bringing me to school. That's the connection that I'm feeling. Those are the things I'm worrying about. Do you see a shift in students' ability to support one another in inhabiting these kind of mindsets?
I do, and there's still work to be done, but I do see a shift in, especially if I can set up the classroom where they're giving each other feedback, and we're working on accountable talk where they're using each other's names and they are talking in a kind way with feedback. And there are still moments where students are not kind. But then it's important to address that and reframe. How can we say that differently? And it's just this constant back and forth process to hopefully by the time that they're done being in my classroom in 7th grade, that there's been some shift in the way that they approach that.
7th grade.
Yeah, good old 7th grade.
Just one more question. So I'm curious and sort of a follow-up into the next steps. Have you all started to think, or is there anything in the works that might actually put a system like this in place for larger school districts that are having to address these same barriers, not from students, but from staff that are needing to have a shift in the culture that comes from the top?
Wow. Sort of, but nothing that is in any shape to, I think, say much at this point. I mean, I think for those kind of entities, even exposure to using Cultivate over a year or two will likely begin to shift and change mindsets in places that begin to, focus them on the fact that, an adult in a classroom has a lot of control over what goes on in that classroom. Boom, take that and work with it. So, there are other things that I think that we can do to try and support those adults in organizationally, and we have the 5 essentials. That's a tool that is in large part designed to say, like, how is this organization shaped and operating in ways that allows it to do the things that it's supposed to do. And so there's some room there to begin to work on some of those things as well.
Please join me in thanking our panel.